Hey guys, tonight we begin with the ancient world of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers that invented cities, invented writing, invented bureaucracy, and then apparently decided that was not enough suffering, and also invented taxes. We are going to spend an ordinary day inside one of the oldest urban civilizations on Earth, and I promise you the word ordinary is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Then, we're going to follow the life of Enheduanna, the daughter of an empire builder, the world's first named author, and a woman who was exiled, restored, and refused to be forgotten across 4,000 years of history. After that, you're going to sit down at a writing desk in a Mesopotamian temple and learn what it meant to be a scribe in a civilization that ran on clay tablets and the quiet terror of getting something wrong. And finally, we're going to look at what a Mesopotamian temple actually was, because the official answer and the real answer are two very different buildings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up before the sun has fully committed to rising, in a city that has been here for so long it has forgotten what it was like to not exist. The walls around you are mud brick, pale and dense, still holding the coolness of the night in the way that only thick walls can, that slow, reluctant release of stored cold before the day comes to collect it. You lie still for a moment, listening. Outside, the city is already making noise. It never really stopped. It just got quieter for a few hours, which is the closest thing to silence that a city of tens of thousands of people is willing to offer. Your bed is a reed mat laid over a packed earth floor. It has done its job in the sense that you are not lying directly on the ground, but it has not done it particularly well. Your lower back has some thoughts about this. Your neck has additional thoughts. You shift, and the mat rustles beneath you, dry and slightly scratchy, and somewhere in the house, a goat registers this movement with a short, irritable sound that tells you the goat is also not thrilled about the morning. You sit up slowly, blinking in the grey pre-dawn light that filters through the narrow high window cut into the wall above you. The room smells of the night, of people sleeping, of the faint animal warmth that comes from living close together in a warm climate without running water. This is not unpleasant exactly. It is simply the smell of life, dense and familiar, the smell of every morning in a house that has held the same family for 3 generations and will hold them for 3 more. You pull yourself to your feet. The floor is cool, almost pleasant on the soles of your feet, which is a temporary condition. By midday it will be warm, by mid-afternoon it will feel like standing on the surface of a bread oven. But for now it is cool, and you take that small mercy with both hands. The city outside your door is though it could just as easily be Nipper or Lagash or Eridu, or any one of a dozen cities pressed together in the flat river-laced land that the people who live here call the land of Sumer. The rivers are called the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they are the reason everything here exists. They brought the water that made the wheat grow. They carry the boats that carry the goods. They flood every year with a regularity that is both deeply reliable and genuinely alarming if you happen to be standing in the wrong place when they decide to expand their sense of self. The people who built this civilization did not choose this land because it was easy. They chose it because it was possible, which is a different thing entirely. And they have spent the last several thousand years arguing with the rivers about the terms of the arrangement. The flood is always somewhere in the back of your mind, the way things are that have happened before and will happen again. The rivers flood every year, in the spring when the snow melts in the mountains to the north, and the water comes down faster than the channels can manage. A normal flood is a managed problem. The irrigation system takes the overflow, distributes it across the fields, deposits the silt that makes the land fertile, and retreats before it causes permanent damage. An abnormal flood is something else. The stories your grandmother told about the great flood that came before her grandmother's time have the particular weight of stories that contain a truth that cannot quite be said directly, the truth that the rivers are larger than the city, that the city exists at their indulgence, and that this indulgence is not guaranteed. The Sumerian flood myth, which you know the way you know the names of the gods, not as a story, but as a piece of your understanding of how the world is arranged, is not a metaphor to you. It is history. It is the record of what the rivers are capable of when they decide to make a point. You step outside into the narrow alley between your house and your neighbours, and the city receives you with its full morning personality. The smell hits first, always the smell, a thick layered thing that contains within it the canal, the animals, the cooking fires already lit in the houses around you, the particular warm mud scent of sun-dried brick that has been absorbing heat and releasing it for so many years it has become indistinguishable from the city itself. This is not a smell you notice consciously anymore. It is simply the smell of the world. The idea that the world might smell differently somewhere else is an abstract thought that has no emotional weight. This is what air is. This is what morning is. The alley is narrow enough that you could touch both walls at once if you stretched. On either side, the upper stories of the houses lean slightly toward each other overhead, the way houses do when they have been built and rebuilt and modified by successive generations who all had different ideas about where the wall should go and none of them ever quite reconciled. The effect is that the sky above you appears as a long pale strip, already lightening toward the particular bright white it will become by noon. You have perhaps 2 hours before that brightness becomes an oppression. Other people are already moving. A woman from 3 houses down emerges with a clay jar balanced on her hip, headed toward the canal. A man leads a small donkey through the alley behind her, the animal moving with the resigned patience of a creature that knows it has been doing this same route every day for its entire life and will continue to do so. A child sits in a doorway eating something, watching you pass with the specific unfiltered curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend not to stare. The city wakes up fast. There is no leisurely morning here, no gradual drift from sleep to activity. The rhythm is immediate. People have things to do that are governed by the heat, and the heat has opinions about when you should be doing them. The work that requires moving around outside is work that gets done in the morning, before the sun becomes a matter of policy. By the time the afternoon arrives, the city will have retreated into a different kind of activity, quieter, more interior, conducted in the shade of walls and doorways with the particular slow efficiency of people who have learned to pace themselves against a climate that does not negotiate. Your first task is water. This is always the first task. The gods are already awake, or at least they are assumed to be. Somewhere inside the ziggurat in the inner sanctum that ordinary people do not enter, the priests who live by the temple's schedule have already performed the first morning rituals, the opening of the shrine, the first offering, the hymn that marks the beginning of the divine day. The god must be acknowledged before the city begins its own day. This is not a formality. It is the foundation on which everything else rests. A city whose god is properly honoured is a city whose god will continue to provide. The rivers water, the fields yield, the protection from the disasters that can descend on an unprotected place without warning. You are aware of this the way you are aware of the structural walls of your house, not constantly, not consciously, but as a background condition of existence, present and reliable, requiring periodic maintenance. Your household jar needs to be filled from the canal, and the canal is 3 alleys and a wider street away, which means 3 alleys and a wider street in which you will encounter the city at its most unfiltered. You lift the jar, settle it against your hip, and begin to walk. The streets of Ur are not what you would call wide. They are what you would call functional, in the sense that 2 people carrying things can pass each other if they make an effort, and neither one is being unreasonable about their personal space. The city was not planned the way a city planner would plan a city. It grew the way organisms grow, finding paths of least resistance, filling available space, creating alleys where gaps existed and widening them over time with the slow erosion of 1 million passing feet. The result is a city that is dense, organic, and deeply legible to the people who live in it, in a way that makes absolutely no sense to anyone arriving for the first time. You know every turn. You know which corner has the lowstone that will catch your sandal in the dark. You know which house has the dog that sounds threatening, but has never actually committed to any action. You know which stretch of alley floods first when the rains come and which stretches stay dry longest. This is the knowledge you have built over years of living inside this specific landscape, and it is as real and as valuable as any knowledge you possess. The street widens as you approach the canal, and here the city is already in full performance. Vendors have set out their goods on reed mats or low wooden frames. Onions, bundles of leeks, dried fish that catch the early light and smell the way only dried fish can smell, which is to say insistently. Barley bread, flat and dense, the kind that stays edible for a long time because it was not particularly fresh when it was baked. Dates, always dates, in baskets and loose piles, the sweetness of them cutting through the morning smell like something that has decided to be pleasant regardless of what is happening around it. You pass a man sitting cross-legged on a mat with a collection of small clay tablets in front of him. He has a stylus tucked behind his ear and an expression that suggests he has been here since before you woke up and will be here after you have gone to bed. He's a scribe for hire, a minor one, the kind who writes letters and receipts and small contracts for people who need things written down but cannot do it themselves. There are many people in this city who cannot write. There are also many things that need to be written. This man sits at the intersection of those two facts and calls it a living, which is accurate if not entirely dignified. Near the canal, the smell changes. The canal water is not clean in any sense that the word is meant to suggest. It carries irrigation, runoff, household waste, the general contributions of a large urban population that uses the waterway for everything simultaneously. It smells accordingly, that particular rich, dark, slightly organic smell that very old waterways develop when they have been serving too many purposes for too long. You're not bothered by this. You have been drinking from this canal carefully after allowing things to settle for your entire life. So has your mother. So did her mother. The canal is what it is, and it keeps you alive, and you are not in a position to be choosy about the details. You fill your jar, watching the sediment swirl and then begin to settle again. Around you, other people are doing the same thing. Women mostly at this hour, the water fetching having become in practice a task assigned by the logic of who is already awake and what needs doing. A few men are here too, hauling larger containers, filling troughs for animals. The canal edge is busy and slightly competitive, everyone angling for the spot with the clearest water and the least foot traffic churning up the bottom. On the opposite bank, a work gang is moving along the edge with long-handled tools, clearing reeds and debris from the channel. Canal maintenance is constant. If you do not tend to irrigation channels continuously, they silt up, overflow in the wrong places, stop delivering water where it needs to go. The cities of Mesopotamia exist because of irrigation. The irrigation exists because of organised labour, and organised labour in this world means workers assembled by temples, by the palace, by the administrative apparatus that has decided whose job this is and what happens if they do not show up. The men on the far bank did not choose this work this morning in any meaningful sense. They were told to be here, and they are here, and somewhere a scribe has recorded that they are here, and somewhere else another scribe has recorded that the scribe recorded it. The paperwork in this civilization is relentless. You carry the water home, feeling the weight of the full jar against your hip and your shoulder, the slight discomfort of the unbalanced load that you have compensated for so many times. Your body does it automatically now, a permanent slight lean that you would not notice on yourself, but that anyone who has never carried a water jar on a hip would find immediately strange. You set the jar down in the corner of the room where it always goes, on the flat stone that keeps it from tipping, in the shade of the wall where it will stay coolest. This is not because you have thought carefully about the physics of water storage. This is because your mother put the jar there, and her mother put the jar there, and the corner and the stone and the shade represent the accumulated practical knowledge of generations of people who learned things the slow and unpleasant way so that you would not have to. Now comes the part of the morning that has been quietly waiting for you the way unpleasant obligations always wait, with infinite patience and absolutely no intention of going anywhere. You have an appointment with the temple. This is not an appointment you made voluntarily. Nobody makes this appointment voluntarily. But you rent land from the temple, as a very large number of people in this city do, because the temple owns a very large number of things, and periodically owing labour or grain or both is the price of access to those things. Today is a Labour Day, not a full day, just a morning, but you're expected to present yourself at the temple precinct and contribute whatever the overseer has decided you will contribute, which you will not know until you arrive because that is how this system communicates its requests, which is to say loudly, in person, at the last moment. The temple district is not far from where you live. Nothing in Ur is very far from the ziggurat, which is the massive stepped tower at the centre of the city that rises above everything else and can be seen from a considerable distance in every direction. It is made of mud brick, like everything else, but mud brick on a scale that requires you to adjust your understanding of what mud brick is capable of. The ziggurat belongs to the moon god Nana, whose city this is in the same way that a city belongs to its founding family, because they were here first, or at least because the story says they were here first, and in a civilization with this much administration, the story and the official record have a way of becoming indistinguishable. The streets are fuller now. The morning is advancing and the city is moving at its full pace. You pass a smith's workshop where the sound of hammering has already begun, a quick rhythmic ringing against the background noise of the city that you hear the way you hear the canal, as part of the texture of things rather than as individual sound. You pass a place where grain is being ground, two women turning handstones in the slow, circular way that grain gets ground everywhere in the ancient world, with the particular expression of people doing a task that requires endurance rather than attention. You pass a butcher's area, or what serves as one, where the smell is different, and the flies have already gathered with considerable enthusiasm. At the temple precinct, you join the loose assembly of people who have arrived with the same reluctant punctuality as you. There is not really a line. There is a kind of organised clustering, people who know the system arranging themselves without being told, presenting themselves to the overseer's assistant, who is a young man with a clay tablet and a stylus, and the very slightly elevated expression of a person who has been given a small amount of authority and is making the most of it. Your name is recorded, or rather the record is made on a tablet, and you recognise the symbols that correspond to you because you have seen them on tablets before, your house's designation, your family, the units of obligation you carry. You're not illiterate exactly. You can read your own name and a few basic symbols. You cannot write them. Most people in this city cannot write. Writing is a skill, a trained and specialised skill, and the people who have it are very aware of the fact that it gives them access to a layer of the world that others cannot enter directly. The scribe with the slightly elevated expression knows this. It is, in part, why the expression is elevated. You're assigned to carry things. This is what you expected. Not the most skilled labour available, not the most dangerous, just the steady, repetitive movement of materials from one place to another inside the temple compound, where construction of a new storage section is underway. Mud bricks made in moulds and dried in the sun by a different set of workers at a different time need to move from the staging area to the wall being built. You carry them. Your back, which already had opinions this morning, files an additional complaint that you will note and do nothing about. The work is not interesting. The work is not meant to be interesting. It is meant to be done. Around you, other people are doing similar things, and the small conversations you have in the rest moments are the actual content of the morning, the exchange of news and complaint and observation that constitutes the social fabric of a city where people live very close together and are regularly assembled for exactly this kind of communal labour. You hear about someone's grain delivery that arrived short. You hear about a dispute between two families over a boundary wall that has now lasted 3 seasons without resolution. You hear, passed from person to person with the particular energy of news that has just arrived from somewhere, that there has been a military expedition to the north, and it was not entirely successful. This last piece of information circulates through the work group in about the time it takes you to make 6 trips with bricks, arriving slightly embellished with each telling, by the end bearing a resemblance to what probably happened that is more atmospheric than factual. The sun climbs. The cool of the morning is gone, decisively gone, in the way of a pleasant thing that has decided not to stay. You are sweating through your linen, the simple wrapped cloth that constitutes your clothing, in the warm months, damp and clinging, and the bricks you're carrying feel heavier than they did an hour ago in the way that weight works when you're hot and your body is trying to argue with physics. The overseer moves through the work area periodically, observing, occasionally saying something to someone, not unpleasant exactly, but with the manner of a person whose job it is to ensure that effort continues and who takes that responsibility seriously. You are released at midday, which is the word I am using for what is actually an informal acknowledgement that the heat has become counterproductive and the overseer has decided that the remaining work can wait until tomorrow, or can be done by a different set of people in the early morning when it is bearable again. You receive a small ration for your labour, a measure of barley and a portion of bread, which you carry home wrapped in a cloth, and which represents a fairly concrete demonstration of how this economy works. You give time and effort, you receive grain. Grain is the currency and the sustenance and the measure of everything in this civilization. the common denominator against which all other values are calculated. There is a document somewhere in the archive that records your presence here today. Your name, or the designation that represents you and your household, is pressed into clay by the same kind of stylus you watched the overseer's assistant use this morning. That record is not about you as a person. It is about the obligation you have fulfilled and the ration you have received in exchange. It is a unit of accounting, not a portrait. You are, from the perspective of the document, a labour unit that has been activated and compensated. You do not find this demeaning. It is simply how the system represents the transaction. You are something much more than a labour unit in your own experience, in the experience of your household, in the experience of your neighbours and your family. But the record does not have space for that, and you do not expect it to. The record has a different job. It keeps the institution functioning. You keep yourself functioning. These are parallel activities that occasionally intersect. The afternoon is the city in a different mode. The streets are quieter, not empty, never empty, but operating at a lower register. People move through shadows where they can find them, hugging the shaded sides of walls, pausing in doorways. The light has become white and hard and uniform, flattening everything it touches. The city looks less textured in this light, more severe, the mud brick walls bleached and pale, the shadows dense and sharp. It is beautiful in the way that very harsh things can be beautiful when they are consistent about it. Inside your house, the temperature is lower by a meaningful amount. The thick walls do their work. You sit in the relative cool and eat a portion of the bread from your morning labour, and you drink water carefully, and you do the thing that most people in this climate do in the worst of the afternoon heat, which is to do as little as possible while still technically remaining alert. Rest is not laziness here. It is resource management. The body that exhausts itself in the afternoon heat is a body that will struggle tomorrow morning. The people of this city have understood this for generations, and their entire daily structure bends around it. In the later afternoon, when the sun has moved past its peak and the light has shifted from white to gold, and the temperature has begun its slow, reluctant retreat, the city comes back to life. This is when the market is at its fullest, when the social interaction of the day concentrates itself, when disputes get aired and deals get made, and the information that has been circulating all day gets processed and redistributed. This is when you go out again, because there are things that need to be acquired, and the acquiring of things in this city happens face to face, in the narrow streets near the canal, and in the slightly wider space that functions as a market, where goods are exchanged for other goods or for measured weights of silver, which the city uses as a medium of exchange because silver does not rot and cannot be easily argued with. You need oil, sesame oil for cooking, for lamps, for the basic maintenance of a household. Your household has run lower than you intended, which is the kind of thing that happens in a life managed on tight margins, where every small shortage is a problem that needs solving before it becomes a larger problem. The oil merchant you usually deal with is a woman whose stall is near the canal end of the main market street, and you have been buying from her for years, which means you know the way she weighs things and she knows the way you haggle, and the whole transaction has a rhythm to it that both of you find mildly satisfying, even if neither of you would use that word. The market is loud in the way that all markets everywhere have always been loud, with the specific noise of people arguing about value in a way that is also partly performance. You pass a transaction in progress that involves barley, a small pig of disputed weight, and two men who have been circling the same disagreement for what looks like the better part of an hour. You pass a weaver selling cloth, a potter with a display of cooking vessels arranged on a mat, a man offering amulets and small figures of the gods that range from genuinely beautiful to deeply optimistic in their claim to be representations of anything in particular. You pass a place where beer is being sold, a thick grain-based drink that you consume through a straw to strain out the solid matter, and which is not so much a luxury as a basic caloric supplement, and also, not incidentally, a consistent source of mild social lubrication in a city where a great many people are under a great many obligations and need somewhere to discuss them. You acquire the oil. The price is slightly higher than it was last month, which the oil merchant explains by reference to a harvest issue upriver and a supply problem she heard about from a trader who came through 3 days ago. You negotiate the price down slightly, which is less about the actual cost and more about maintaining the protocol of the relationship, which requires that both parties demonstrate they are taking the transaction seriously. You leave with the oil and the comfortable feeling of having conducted a routine transaction within the expected parameters of a world that contains, inside all its administrative weight and religious obligation and physical difficulty, these small, ordinary satisfactions that make a day feel navigable. There is something worth pausing to understand about the economy you are embedded in, because it is doing things that are easy to misread from the outside. Mesopotamia does not have coins. That fact, which seems like a limitation, is actually a description of a sophisticated system that is simply using different instruments. The primary medium of everyday exchange is barley, measured in standard units, stored in vessels of known capacity, used to pay wages, settle debts, buy goods, and calculate. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. For higher value transactions, silver is used, weighed against standard measures, not minted into coins but simply measured out on a scale. You carry a small lump of silver, kept in a fold of your clothing, that represents a significant portion of your household's liquid wealth. It is not particularly impressive to look at. It is a dull, grey chunk of metal. But it is what stands between your household and a serious problem if the barley runs short before the next harvest, and you're very aware of exactly where it is at all times. The barley economy connects every household in this city to every other household, through the market, through the temple, through the palace, through the network of loans and obligations and informal arrangements that form the actual texture of daily economic life. You owe the temple owes the palace, in a sense, or at least the palace has claims on temple surpluses in certain circumstances. Your neighbour owes a merchant who owes a distant trading partner who sent goods upriver in exchange for goods that will go back downriver in a different season. The whole thing is a continuous negotiation conducted in grain and silver and clay tablets, a web of obligation and expectation that keeps the city fed and functioning, and also periodically produces the kind of dispute that ends up in front of the assembly or in the hands of a temple official, or scratched onto a tablet by both parties and held in trust by a third party whom neither of them is certain they trust but who is at least neutral. You pass a house where a door is marked with a symbol you recognise as connected to a local debt arrangement, a small clay tag on the door frame that says, in the language of marks, that this household has a current obligation to a specific institution. You do not know the details and you do not need to. The details are in the archive. The mark on the door is simply the physical evidence that the archive has a claim here. You feel a small, involuntary gratitude that your own door is not marked, and then you feel the slightly less comfortable recognition that it could be, not this season, but possibly next season, if the barley yield is what the last 2 weeks of growing weather suggest it might be, which is not what you had hoped. Debt in ancient Mesopotamia is not a shameful abstraction. It is a practical reality that most households navigate at some point, because the agricultural cycle is uneven, and the obligations that land tenure, temple service, and daily survival impose on a household are relentless and do not adjust themselves to the quality of the harvest. Loans are available from the temple, from private merchants, from wealthier neighbours who have grain to spare and would like it back with a reasonable return. The interest rates are fixed by convention and are not low. You borrow barley in spring and repay barley in autumn, with an additional portion on top that reflects the lender's risk and the time value of the resource. If the harvest is good, this is manageable. If the harvest is bad, you're now behind going into the next cycle, and the gap can grow faster than you expect. There are people in this city who have fallen out of that cycle entirely. You have seen them. Near the temple district, in the spaces between the major buildings, in the narrower alleys where the shade lasts longer and the traffic is lighter, there are households that have slipped past the point where ordinary debt management still applies. They are not starving quite, because the temple has mechanisms for distributing minimum rations to the city's most destitute, and because the web of neighbourhood obligation means that someone's cousin or former neighbour will usually share bread before they watch a family actually collapse. But they are on the wrong side of a line, dependent on systems that were not designed for them and that do not, in their daily operation, concern themselves very much with whether being dependent on them is comfortable or dignified. You know a family in that situation? They are not people who made obvious mistakes. The husband got sick 2 seasons ago, the kind of illness that takes several months rather than several days, and during those months the household missed its labour obligations and fell behind on its grain contributions and had to borrow to maintain basic food supply, and by the time he recovered, The debts had accumulated to a point where the next several harvests were already spoken for. They are managing. They are, as a family, demonstrating the kind of persistent practical competence that survival in a difficult situation requires. But the margin they are operating on is very thin, and thin margins in this world respond badly to any additional pressure. You think about this occasionally, not obsessively, but in the way you think about weather, which is to say as a background awareness of conditions that could become relevant to you at any moment. You are not in that situation. You are not near that situation, but the distance between where you are and where they are is measured in a few bad harvests and a few missed obligations, not in any fundamental difference in character or capability or worth. The city does not make a moral distinction. It makes a practical one. You can contribute or you cannot. If you can, you are part of the system. If you cannot, you are dependent on the system's charity, which is real but limited and not particularly warm about how it is delivered. The city has seen worse. That's a thought that exists somewhere in the background of most difficult things here, a historical sediment of accumulated disasters that puts the present one in proportion. There was the year the river came very high, and the lower quarter flooded, and 3 streets of houses were destroyed and rebuilt. There was the epidemic that took a significant portion of the population before it passed. There was the military campaign that came through the region and extracted tribute that left the temple stores low for 2 seasons afterward. These events are in the living memory of the oldest people in your neighbourhood, passed from person to person in the way that important information passes when writing is expensive and most households don't have direct access to the archive. The oral record is not less accurate for being oral. It is differently accurate, more personal, more emotionally textured, less precise about dates and quantities, but more precise about what things felt like and what people did. Your grandmother knows things about this city that no clay tablet contains. Most of them she will take with her when she goes. The afternoon light continues its slow progression toward evening. You make your way home through the market's thinning crowd, past the vendor who is beginning to pack away his onion baskets, past the scribe who is still sitting on his mat but is now staring into the middle distance with the expression of a man who's either meditating or asleep upright, past the corner where 3 children are having a heated discussion that appears to involve a piece of rope and some principle that all 3 of them hold strongly, but none of them can articulate to the other's satisfaction. The city is winding down, or rather, it is shifting registers, transitioning from the morning's productive urgency and the afternoon's heat-enforced pause to the evening's social and domestic mode. You pass the house of a neighbour who has recently become a father for the 2nd time. There is a kind of informal acknowledgement between the 2 of you as you pass, a nod that contains within it a recognition of shared circumstance. Both of you embedded in the same city, the same system, the same set of obligations and satisfactions and uncertainties. Neither of you says any of this. You nod and you continue walking. But the nod is real, and what it contains is real, and in a city this dense and this old, that kind of unspoken recognition between people who have lived near each other for years is one of the actual textures of community. Not dramatic, not recorded, not the kind of thing that ends up pressed into clay, but present, running through the daily life of the city like the water running through the canal, supporting the whole weight of the thing without anyone thinking to mention it, because it is simply always there. The evening comes down fast, the way evenings do in flat landscapes without the hills to slow the sunset. The sky to the west goes orange and then red, and then a deep bruised purple that seems to press downward toward the city. The temperature drops, not all the way to comfortable, but in the direction of it. People light small oil lamps in their doorways, and the evening smell of the city adds lamp smoke to its usual composition. A warm, slightly fatty smell that is the smell of the city in transition from day to night. You eat in the evening, a proper meal, the main meal of the day, the one that gathers the household together in the way that a shared activity creates a brief sense of completeness around what is otherwise a dispersed and individually managed existence. Bread, always bread, and lentils cooked with onion and garlic and a little bit of the oil you bought today, and dates if there are dates, and beer if there is beer, and conversation that covers the day's news and the day's complaints and the day's small observations about what is happening in the city and what it might mean for you. The gods are part of this evening, as they are part of everything. Mesopotamia does not have a private life that is entirely separate from its religious life. The gods are present everywhere, in the river, in the weather, in the outcome of your grain harvest and the health of your animals and the success or failure of your business dealings. You have a small household shrine, a niche in the wall with a clay figure in it, a personal god, the minor divine intermediary through whom your household's concerns are transmitted to the larger divine hierarchy. You acknowledge it in the evening the way you acknowledge the lamp and the water jar and the reed mat as a necessary and ordinary part of the household equipment, with neither excessive reverence nor neglect. The night closes in around the city in stages. First the market empties, then the streets quiet, then the alleys, which were never exactly loud but were always occupied, begin to hold only the occasional movement. Someone coming home late, someone walking a route that only makes sense to them. The canal makes its own sound, a low, steady movement that is always there but only becomes audible when the other sounds have stepped back. Dogs, somewhere, are having a conversation that seems to matter greatly to them and not at all to anyone else. You lie down on the reed mat and feel the day settling into your body the way physical work always settles, a general heaviness that is not quite comfortable, but is at least honest. Your back still has opinions, your shoulders are reporting in. The part of your feet where the sandal strap sits has a specific grievance it would like to file. You listen to these reports with the experienced patience of someone who has been receiving them for years and knows that they do not require a response, only acknowledgement. The city breathes around you. Somewhere a child is being settled. Somewhere an animal shifts. Somewhere the work that never stops continues. The guards at the city gate, the priests in the temple maintaining the fires that are never supposed to go out, the canal water moving through the dark with the indifference of a system that does not observe rest days. This city is 4,000 years old or something approaching it, and it will be here tomorrow, and your children will wake up in it and feel the cool floor under their feet and walk to the canal with a jar and negotiate for oil and carry bricks for the temple and eat bread and lentils in the evening and lie down on a mat and feel the day settling in the same way. This is not a tragedy. It is not a triumph. It is the texture of a life inside a civilization that is very old and very functional and not particularly interested in whether you personally find it comfortable. There is one more thing about this day that needs to be said, and it is the thing that the day does not say about itself, which is that it is exactly the same as yesterday and will be exactly the same as tomorrow and has been essentially the same for the entire duration of your life and your parents' lives and their parents' lives before that. The rhythms of this city are ancient in the most literal sense. The canal has been here, in some form, for longer than anyone can remember. The temple has been here. The market has been here. The obligation to perform labour for the institution has been here. The relentless heat of summer and the careful management of water have been here. The specific combination of stability and pressure that defines urban life in ancient Mesopotamia has been here so long it has become the definition of what life is. This is not a complaint exactly. It is more like an observation made from inside the thing being observed, which is always the most complicated angle. You cannot stand outside your own civilization and evaluate it. You can only live inside it, and the living contains both the weight of the obligation and the satisfaction of the structure, both the frustration of the constraint and the comfort of the known. You know what today will bring. You knew it when you woke up. That predictability is not a limitation. It is, in a certain light, a form of security that people in less stable circumstances would recognize immediately as precious. The city around you has survived floods, droughts, wars, and the rise and fall of empires, the Sumerian city-states giving way to the Akkadian Empire, and then the third dynasty of Ur, and then successive waves of political reorganization that changed who sat on the throne without changing very much, what the canal looked like or how the temple operated or what the market smelled like in the late afternoon. The institutions persisted because the needs they served persisted, and the people inside the institutions persisted too, doing what needed doing, keeping the records, carrying the water, negotiating for the oil, going to bed tired and waking up before the sun with the canal making its sound, and the day beginning again. You close your eyes. The canal goes on making its sound, the city goes on being the city, and somewhere in the warm, dense, complicated dark, continues its long, relentless conversation with time. But this city produced more than ordinary days. It produced something that the world had not seen before and has not quite recovered from since. A woman who decided that her name and her voice and her grief and her faith deserved to be written down, permanently, in clay, in words that she shaped herself. And because clay is harder to destroy than almost anything, that decision survived 4,000 years to reach us, still pressing in the same marks she pressed, still carrying the same weight she carried. Her name was Enheduanna, and her story begins with an empire. Sargon of Akkad built the first empire in recorded history. That sentence sounds simple. It is not simple. Before Sargon, the cities of Mesopotamia were independent, competitive, frequently at war with each other, and organised around their own gods and their own kings in a pattern that had been going on for so long it felt like the natural order of things. Sargon looked at that pattern and decided it was a problem he could solve, and then he spent decades solving it, in the way that problems get solved when the solution involves armies and a very consistent willingness to continue advancing. He conquered city after city, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, creating a unified political structure that covered more territory than anyone had ever brought under one authority before. He called himself King of the Four Corners of the Earth. His contemporaries thought this was an exaggeration. His successors were not entirely sure it was. The empire Sargon built was called the Akkadian Empire, named for Akkad, his capital city, whose exact location we still do not know with certainty, which is one of the more interesting ironies in the archaeology of the ancient Near East. He rose from obscure origins, a cupbearer to a local king, according to some traditions, which is the ancient world's way of saying he came from somewhere unremarkable, and was therefore more impressive for having arrived where he arrived. He was a conqueror, which in his world was not a neutral description. Conquest was the primary mechanism of political consolidation, and being good at it was considered a straightforward marker of competence and divine favour. The gods wanted you to win. If you kept winning, that confirmed that the gods wanted you to win. The logic was circular, but it was consistent, and in a world where divine sanction was the primary source of political legitimacy, consistency counted for a great deal. The administrative language of the empire was Akkadian, a Semitic language that was linguistically quite different from Sumerian, the language of the southern cities like Ur. The two languages coexisted in Mesopotamia for centuries in a relationship that was partly political and partly practical. Akkadian became the language of administration, international correspondence, and the palace, while Sumerian remained the language of religious ritual, literary tradition, and sacred text. This linguistic division was consequential. It meant that the scribal profession operated in two registers simultaneously, that the educated administrators of the empire had to be fluent in both, and that the temples, which were the centres of Sumerian cultural and religious life, maintained their distinctive identity even within an empire organised by Akkadian-speaking conquerors. Sargon's methods of consolidation were varied. Military conquest was the most obvious, but he also worked to tie the conquered cities into his imperial structure through administrative appointments, through the repositioning of loyal officials in key roles, and through the kind of symbolic gestures that communicated his relationship to the Sumerian divine order without entirely displacing it. The appointment of his daughter as end priestess was one of these gestures, but it was also more than a gesture. It was a structural move, embedding his family in the institution that defined the religious and cultural identity of the empire's southern core. He was also, by the standards of his era, an extraordinarily effective military commander. The later traditions that grew up around his name attributed to him campaigns in every direction, to Anatolia in the northwest, to the Persian Gulf in the south, to the mountains of Iran in the east. Some of these traditions are exaggerated, as traditions about successful conquerors always tend to be. Others represent real historical expansion of Akkadian influence across a remarkably large area. The empire he built was not permanent. It lasted roughly a century and a half before the combination of internal rebellions and external pressures from surrounding peoples brought it to an end. But while it lasted, it was the largest and most complex political structure the world had yet seen, and it left behind administrative and cultural patterns that shaped Mesopotamian civilization for centuries after it dissolved. Into this specific historical moment, with all of its complexity and ambition and pressure, Enheduanna was born and placed and charged with maintaining a sacred function at the intersection of the old Sumerian world and the new Akkadian Empire. And into this empire, sometime around 2,285 years before the Common Era, his daughter was born. We do not know her birth name. What we know is the name she took when she was appointed to her role, Enheduanna. The name means something like the high priestess adorned with the jewelry of heaven, which tells you immediately that this is not a name someone gives themselves in a modest moment. This is a name that makes a claim about a person's place in the world, and in Enheduanna's case the claim was accurate. Her father appointed her as priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur. This is worth pausing to understand fully, because the role of priestess was not a ceremonial title. It was not a way of keeping the king's daughter occupied, or honouring a beloved child with something that sounded important without being important. The priestess of Nanna was one of the most powerful religious figures in Mesopotamia. She was the earthly representative of the city's primary god, the human face of divine authority, and through that relationship she wielded genuine political and social influence in a city that was the religious heart of the empire. Sargon was making a calculated move when he placed his daughter in this role. He was anchoring his family's authority inside the most sacred institution in the most sacred city, weaving his political empire into the religious fabric of Sumerian civilization in a way that would be very difficult to unpick. The calculation was sophisticated because it worked on multiple levels simultaneously. For the people of Ur, who were Sumerian, their relationship with the Akkadian Empire was complicated. Sargon had conquered them. He had imposed an Akkadian administration. He had, in the language that conquerors always use, unified the region under a new and beneficial authority. The Sumerians had their own view of this, which was not always identical to the conqueror's self-description. Placing Sargon's daughter in the most sacred role in Ur's most important institution was a way of inserting Akkadian authority into the heart of Sumerian religious life, while giving it a Sumerian face. The priestess would perform the Sumerian rituals. She would speak the Sumerian divine language. She would maintain the Sumerian temple, but she would be the emperor's daughter, and the people would know it, and the combination was intended to make resistance to the empire feel like resistance to the god himself. Whether Enheduanna understood this calculation when she entered the role, we cannot know. She was presumably young, entering a position defined by her father's political logic. But what she became inside that position suggests a person who understood not just the ritual requirements of the role, but its full institutional weight, and who used that weight for her own purposes as well as her father's. The role had practical dimensions that were inseparable from its sacred ones. As priestess, Enheduanna administered a significant institutional apparatus. The Temple of Nanna was a major economic entity, with land, workers, and resources that required management. She would have had subordinate priests and administrators working under her authority. She would have been responsible for maintaining the ritual calendar, ensuring the daily offerings were made correctly, overseeing the ceremonies that marked the agricultural seasons and the divine festivals. This was not a passive role, it was an active one, requiring both theological knowledge and organisational competence, both of which she appears to have possessed in considerable quantity. She also, and this is the part that separates her from every other high priestess in Mesopotamian history, wrote not administrative texts, not the formulaic records that her temple would have produced in enormous quantity for practical purposes. She wrote hymns, she wrote poetry, she wrote in a way that was self-consciously literary, that drew on the conventions of the existing religious tradition and then did something unusual with them, made them personal, made them argue, made them carry the weight of an individual voice rather than the smooth, impersonal register of official religious composition. What Sargon perhaps did not fully account for was that his daughter was also, quietly and then less quietly, a writer of extraordinary power. The hymns Enheduanna composed are not what we might expect from a political appointment to a ceremonial role. They are not formal, measured celebrations of divine perfection, delivered in the appropriate official tone. They are something far stranger and more alive. They are passionate, they are angry in places, they are grief-stricken in others, they argue with the gods, they describe suffering with a directness that feels almost uncomfortable in a ritual context. The most famous of them, a hymn to the goddess Inanna, does not merely praise Inanna's greatness, it argues for it, it makes a case, it presents evidence. The narrator of the hymn is not a neutral voice offering worship. The narrator is a person who has been through something, and is speaking from inside that experience with all the urgency of someone who needs the goddess to understand how serious things are. We know what she had been through, at least in outline, because she tells us. There was a rebellion. Naram-Sin, who may have been her nephew or another relative in Sargon's dynastic line, was not yet the ruler, and in the political instability following Sargon's death, a man named Lugalane seized power in Ur and drove Enheduanna out. She was removed from her role, expelled from the temple that had been her world for decades, stripped of the title and the authority and the sacred function that defined her entire existence. She was exiled. Exile in the ancient world was not a comfortable retirement to a pleasant location. Exile meant loss of identity, loss of protection, loss of the community that gave your life meaning and structure. For a woman whose entire sense of self was organised around her sacred role in the city of Ur, exile was a kind of dissolution. She was no longer the priestess. She was no longer the voice between her city and its god. She was just a woman, displaced, in a world that did not have a category for her that meant anything good. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The specific circumstances of her exile are not entirely clear to us. We know she was expelled. We know it was connected to the political instability that followed her father's death, as various factions competed for control of the empire and different cities asserted their independence or aligned themselves with different claimants. Ur was one of the key contested prizes, both because of its religious prestige and because of its economic importance as a port city on the Persian Gulf trade routes. Whoever controlled Ur, and whoever controlled the Temple of Nanna, controlled something that mattered to the whole region in a way that went beyond the merely local. Lugalene understood this. His seizure of power in Ur was not an accident or an opportunistic local rebellion. It was a calculated political move in a much larger contest, and removing Sargon's daughter from the temple was part of that calculation. Remove the symbol and you loosen the claim. The fact that she tried to maintain her position is suggested by the hymns themselves, which contain within them not just the expression of her distress, but the records of her attempts to argue her case through the divine channels available to her. She was not passive, she was not silent. She was making her argument through the most powerful medium available to her in her world, which was the hymn, the public religious composition performed in the temple context and heard by the community that depended on the temple's divine relationships for its own welfare. Her suffering was not a private matter. She was making it public, in the way that the most skilled rhetoricians always make their individual cases into universal ones, connecting her specific injustice to the larger question of whether the divine order was functioning as it should. The man who expelled her, Lugalane, is mentioned in the compositions with a flatness that is more chilling than anger would be. He is not elaborated, he is not mourned, he is simply the fact of what happened, the cause of the situation that the goddess must now address. Enheduanna's emotional energy in the composition goes not toward her enemy, but toward the goddess, because the goddess is the one with the power to change the outcome, and the enemy is simply the instrument of the problem rather than its source. This is sophisticated thinking. It is also, given that she was presumably writing from a position of vulnerability and distress, a remarkable demonstration of rhetorical control. And she wrote about it. That is the remarkable thing. She did not merely endure and return, leaving the experience behind. She wrote about what it felt like, in terms specific enough and personal enough that the writing has survived 4,000 years and still carries recognizable human weight. In the composition known as the Exaltation of Inanna, she describes her situation with a clarity that feels almost shocking, given the formal religious context. She says she has been made to stand outside the sacred house like an enemy. She says she has been reduced to something like nothing. She says her mouth, the mouth that once sang praise at the proper times and in the proper ceremonies, has been turned to dust. She is speaking to the goddess as one person speaks to another, not with the performed deference of official religion, but with the exhausted directness of someone who has nothing left to lose by saying exactly what is true. The hymn makes a case for Inanna's supreme power among the gods. It is a sophisticated theological argument as well as a personal plea, and it uses the rhetorical resources available to Enheduanna with impressive skill. Inanna is described across many of her domains as a goddess of war, of love, of transformation, of boundary crossing, of the storm. The descriptions accumulate into a portrait of a deity who transcends ordinary categories, who is present in every kind of human extreme, who cannot be contained within a single function or a single identity. This is not simple praise. It is a carefully constructed argument that Inanna's power is uniquely comprehensive, uniquely supreme, and therefore uniquely capable of addressing an injustice that lesser divine interventions might not reach. The argument is also, unmistakably, a plea. Restore me. See what has been done. Let the justice that you have the power to deliver be delivered. It is petition through praise, an extremely sophisticated piece of rhetoric that uses the conventions of divine worship to make a thoroughly human argument about a specific personal political injustice. The argument is structured in a way that accumulates rather than simply lists. You are taken through Inanna's domains one by one, each one described with a specificity that feels like testimony rather than catalogue. She is the one who turns a man into a woman at her glance. She is the one who takes the shepherd's crook from kings. She is the goddess of the boundary between categories, the one who moves between heaven and earth, between war and love, between masculine and feminine, between life and death. In the ancient Near Eastern divine hierarchy, this boundary-crossing quality was both celebrated and regarded with a certain wariness. Inanna was powerful precisely because she was not contained by the usual rules, and the hymn makes this the foundation of its argument. If you are outside the categories, you are outside the limitations that bind other divine beings. You can do what others cannot. Therefore, you can restore what has been taken. The emotional register of the hymn is one of the things that makes it genuinely unusual in the context of ancient Mesopotamian religious literature. Official hymns to deities were typically formal, measured, maintaining a decorous distance between the worshipper and the worshipped. Enheduanna's hymns collapse that distance in places where she chooses to. She inserts her own experience into the theological argument, I have borne all that she bestowed on me, I have borne what Inanna has poured on me. The first person is uncomfortable, visible in a way that religious composition of this period usually was not, and that discomfort is the point. She is not performing piety from a respectful distance. She's standing in the middle of her own suffering and arguing from there, which is a more exposed position and a rhetorically bolder one. Scholars have debated how to classify what Enheduanna was doing. Was she writing religious literature, political literature, personal poetry? The answer is probably all three simultaneously, which is not unusual for ancient Near Eastern composition, but which is particularly concentrated in her work. The political argument that the goddess who empowers the dynasty should protect the dynasty's representative is inseparable from the personal argument that a woman who has served faithfully deserves to be restored is inseparable from the theological argument that Inanna's supremacy among the gods demands that she act when her servants are wronged. The layers reinforce each other. Remove any one of them, and the composition loses some of its force. We know the plea was answered, or at least that the circumstances changed in her favour. The rebellion that expelled her was eventually put down, the political order stabilised, and Enheduanna was restored to her role in the Temple of Nanna at Ur. She returned, and when she returned she wrote about that too with the same directness with which she had described her exile. The light is sweet again, she writes. She herself has been restored to her rightful place. She names herself in her own compositions in a way that was essentially unprecedented at the time, using the first person to anchor the work to herself as an individual, refusing to let these words float free of their author into the anonymity that most writing of this period maintained. I am Enheduanna. The words I am writing are mine. This self-identification is not a minor stylistic choice. It is a declaration, a claim on authorship that preceded the next known named author by something like 500 years. Before Enheduanna, we have texts, but we do not have names attached to them in this way. She's the first person in recorded history to sign their work. Everything before her is anonymous. She, for reasons that may have been political, personal, religious, or simply the expression of a personality that was not interested in disappearing, decided that this was not good enough. The words were hers. The name would be attached to them. The record would show who made them. The record did show it. Libraries preserved copies of her hymns for centuries after her death, repeatedly recopied on fresh tablets by scribes who considered them worth preserving, which in ancient Mesopotamia was the closest thing to a standing ovation the culture could provide. She was not merely archived, she was studied. She was referenced. She was treated as a foundational figure in the literary tradition that she had, largely without meaning to, established. The question of why she was preserved is worth sitting with. The practical reason is that scribble students copied her work as part of their training, which gave her texts a distribution and replication that most religious compositions never achieved. But that circular answer raises a prior question. Why were her texts selected for the curriculum in the first place? The scribal curriculum was not randomly assembled. It reflected decisions made by the people who ran the Adaba about what qualified as culturally important, worth preserving, worth transmitting to the next generation. Someone, at some point relatively soon after her death, decided that her compositions belonged in that category. That decision was then confirmed by successive generations of educators who kept her work in the curriculum rather than replacing it with something newer or more fashionable. The most likely explanation is that her compositions were recognised as genuinely excellent examples of their form. The exaltation of Inanna in particular has a rhetorical architecture that is sophisticated by any standard, and its emotional directness, which must have felt unusual when it was new, apparently read over time as a virtue rather than a deviation. It showed what the hymn form could do when handled by someone with both skill and something genuine to say. Educators recognised this. Students copied it. The copies multiplied. And 4,000 years later, we have more than 50 surviving exemplars of a single composition, which is an extraordinary survival rate for any text from this period. The restoration itself, the moment when she returned to her role in the Temple of Nanna, is described in the exaltation with a vividness that suggests she felt it as more than just a political correction. She writes of it as a sacred restoration, a reordering of the divine world that placed her back in her proper relationship with Inanna and with the institution she had been expelled from. Whether she saw the goddess as having personally intervened, or whether the language of divine intervention was the conventional framework within which all political events were understood, we cannot say with confidence. Probably both were true simultaneously. In a world where the gods were understood to be active participants in historical events, a political outcome that reversed an injustice was a demonstration of divine will, and experiencing it as such was not a metaphor. It was a description of how reality worked. After her restoration, she continued to serve for many years. The record of her life after the exile is less dramatic than the record of the exile itself, which is typical of how stories work. The crisis generates narrative, the resolution produces quiet. She performed the rituals, she administered the institution, she presumably continued to compose, though we cannot be certain which of her surviving texts were written before the exile, during it, or after the restoration. The compositions do not come with reliable dates attached. We have the works, the general outline of her biography, and the knowledge that she was active at the beginning of the 23rd century before the Common Era, which is 4,300 years ago as a round number that is easier to hold in your mind than to fully feel. The length of her tenure as En Priestess is remarkable in itself. She served across the reigns of her father Sargon, her brother Rimush, and her other brother Manishtushu, and probably into the reign of her nephew Naram Sin, who was the next great ruler of the Akkadian Empire, and who later became a figure of such legendary military achievement that subsequent Mesopotamian tradition treated him as almost mythological. She outlasted several kings. She outlasted her own moment of crisis. She outlasted, in the most permanent possible sense, the empire itself, because the empire is gone and her words are still here. The scale of the preservation is worth noting. We have found more than 50 tablets containing copies of her exaltation of Inanna, spanning a period of roughly 500 years after her death. This is not a document that survived by accident. This is a document that people kept copying because they kept finding it worth copying. Scribal students copied it as part of their training, which means that for 5 centuries after Enheduanna died, young men learning to write were learning to write in part by pressing her words into clay. Her voice was the practice material. Her argument was the text through which the next generation of scribes learned to control the stylus. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. The idea of her careful, urgent personal compositions becoming the medium through which a profession reproduced itself. She also composed the collection of hymns to temples known as the Sumerian temple hymns, 42 hymns addressed to the major temples of Sumer and Akkad, each one describing the particular character and divine significance of a specific sacred building. These are more formal than the Inanna hymns, more closely aligned with the conventions of official religious composition, but they are not less accomplished for that. They represent an organizing intelligence at work, someone who understood the religious geography of the entire civilization and could address each node in that geography with the specific vocabulary it required. They are, among other things, a comprehensive record of the temple landscape of a world that has since been largely buried, a literary map of sacred space that tells us where the temples were and what they were for and how the people who served them thought about what they were doing. The Sumerian temple hymns are 42 in number, and each one is addressed to a specific temple in a specific city, describing the physical structure of the building, the divine resident within it, the rituals performed there, and the relationship between that particular sacred space and the broader order of the cosmos. They are a systematic survey of the religious landscape of the civilization, organised in a specific geographic order that moves through the major temple cities of Sumer and Akkad. Reading them is like being handed a map of the sacred world of ancient Mesopotamia, not the political map, not the economic map, but the map that shows where the divine resided and what each residence was for. What is remarkable about this collection, beyond its sheer scope, is that it represents a kind of intellectual project. It is not just a collection of separate hymns. It is an organised, comprehensive attempt to account for the entire temple system of the civilization in a single literary framework. This suggests an organising intelligence at work that is doing something beyond the production of individual religious texts. It is creating a literary record of the civilization's sacred geography, a record that would allow anyone with access to the collection to know, for every major temple in the known world, what it was, who it housed, and why it mattered. This is, in a sense, an archival project as well as a literary one, and the choice to make it literary, to give it the form of hymns rather than administrative records, means that it preserved and transmitted its information through the channels of cultural prestige rather than administrative routine, which is part of why it survived. The exaltation of Inanna and the temple hymns represent two different registers of Enheduanna's work, one intensely personal, one systematically encyclopedic. Together they suggest a mind that was both deeply engaged with its own experience and capable of stepping back to see the whole. This combination is unusual in any era. In hers, it was extraordinary. She lived into old age, as far as we can tell, continuing to serve as priestess, continuing to compose, continuing to be a person whose presence in the city of was felt and recorded. She outlasted her own exile. She outlasted her own moment of powerlessness. She became, across the long decades of her life, something that the civilization needed to account for in its understanding of what a person could be and what a person could leave behind. She left behind 42 hymns to temples and the gods housed in them. She left behind the exaltation of Inanna. She left behind the composition that scholars call the hymn to Inanna as Queen of Heaven. And she left behind her name, pressed into clay in her own lifetime by scribes who understood that this was a person whose words were worth keeping. 4,000 years later, her compositions are still being read, translated and studied by people who never heard of Sargon's empire, except as historical context for the woman who wrote about what it felt like to stand outside the sacred house like an enemy. That is a kind of survival that very few people in any era have managed to achieve, and she managed it through words, shaped carefully, deliberately, with the clear and slightly combative intention of making herself impossible to forget. There is a cast of her portrait found at housed in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. A small disc, a votive disc, showing a woman in a ritual procession. Scholars believe this is Enheduanna herself, which would make it one of the earliest portraits of a named individual in human history. She stands in a long robe, her head covered in the elaborate headdress of the priestess, participating in the rituals she was restored to perform. The face is stylized, as all faces are in this period's art, and we cannot know from it what she actually looked like. But she is there, still present in the clay, still making her claim on the record, 4,000 years later, in a museum in a city she could not have imagined, being studied by people in a language she never heard. There is a kind of quiet irony in the fact that the civilization that produced Enheduanna's literary voice also contained, inside its temples and its administrative buildings, the profession that made all of that possible. Not the priestesses and not the kings, but the scribes, the trained specialists who held the written record of everything and were simultaneously indispensable and invisible. And sitting down at a scribal desk in ancient Mesopotamia was not, it turns out, a comfortable or uncomplicated occupation. Let us find out what it was actually like. We do not know her birth name. What we know is the name she took when she was appointed to her role, Enheduanna. The name means something like the high priestess adorned with the jewellery of heaven, which tells you immediately that this is not a name someone gives themselves in a modest moment. This is a name that makes a claim about a person's place in the world, and in Enheduanna's case the claim was accurate. Her father appointed her as priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur. This is worth pausing to understand fully, because the role of priestess was not a ceremonial title. It was not a way of keeping the king's daughter occupied or honouring a beloved child with something that sounded important without being important. The priestess of Nanna was one of the most powerful religious figures in Mesopotamia. She was the earthly representative of the city's primary god, the human face of divine authority, and through that relationship she wielded genuine political and social influence in a city that was the religious heart of the empire. Sargon was making a calculated move when he placed his daughter in this role. He was anchoring his family's authority inside the most sacred institution, in the most sacred city, weaving his political empire into the religious fabric of Sumerian civilization in a way that would be very difficult to unpick. What Sargon perhaps did not fully account for was that his daughter was also, quietly and then less quietly, a writer of extraordinary power. The hymns Enheduanna composed are not what we might expect from a political appointment to a ceremonial role. They are not formal, measured celebrations of divine perfection, delivered in the appropriate official tone. They are something far stranger and more alive. They are passionate. They are angry in places. They are grief-stricken in others. They argue with the gods. They describe suffering with a directness that feels almost uncomfortable in a ritual context. The most famous of them, a hymn to the goddess Inanna, does not merely praise Inanna's greatness. It argues for it. It makes a case. It presents evidence. The narrator of the hymn is not a neutral voice offering worship. The narrator is a person who has been through something and is speaking from inside that experience with all the urgency of someone who needs the goddess to understand how serious things are. We know what she'd been through, at least in outline, because she tells us. There was a rebellion. Naram-Sin, who may have been her nephew or another relative in Sargon's dynastic line, was not yet the ruler, and in the political instability following Sargon's death, a man named Lugalane seized power in Ur and drove Enheduanna out. She was removed from her role, expelled from the temple that had been her world for decades, stripped of the title and the authority and the sacred function that defined her entire existence. She was exiled. Exile in the ancient world was not a comfortable retirement to a pleasant location. Exile meant loss of identity, loss of protection, loss of the community that gave your life meaning and structure. For a woman whose entire sense of self was organised around her sacred role in the city of Ur, exile was a kind of dissolution. She was no longer the priestess. She was no longer the voice between her city and its god. She was just a woman, displaced, in a world that did not have a category for her that meant anything good. And she wrote about it. That is the remarkable thing. She did not merely endure and return, leaving the experience behind. She wrote about what it felt like, in terms specific enough and personal enough that the writing has survived 4,000 years and still carries recognizable human weight. In the composition known as the Exaltation of Inanna, she describes her situation with a clarity that feels almost shocking, given the formal, religious context. She says she has been made to stand outside the sacred house like an enemy. She says she has been reduced to something like nothing. She says her mouth, the mouth that once sang praise at the proper times and in the proper ceremonies, has been turned to dust. She is speaking to the goddess as one person speaks to another, not with the performed deference of official religion, but with the exhausted directness of someone who has nothing left to lose by saying exactly what is true. The hymn makes a case for Inanna's supreme power among the gods, but it is also unmistakably a plea. Restore me, see what has been done, let the justice that you have the power to deliver be delivered. It is petition through praise, an extremely sophisticated piece of rhetoric that uses the conventions of divine worship to make a thoroughly human argument about a specific personal political injustice. We know the plea was answered, or at least that the circumstances changed in her favour. The rebellion that expelled her was eventually put down, the political order stabilised, and Enheduanna was restored to her role in the Temple of Nanna at Ur. She returned. And when she returned, she wrote about that too with the same directness with which she had described her exile. The light is sweet again, she writes. She herself has been restored to her rightful place. She names herself in her own compositions in a way that was essentially unprecedented at the time, using the first person to anchor the work to herself as an individual, refusing to let these words float free of their author into the anonymity that most writing of this period maintained. I am Enheduanna. The words I am writing are mine. This self-identification is not a minor stylistic choice, it is a declaration, a claim on authorship that preceded the next known named author by something like 500 years. Before Enheduanna, we have texts, but we do not have names attached to them in this way. She's the first person in recorded history to sign their work. Everything before her is anonymous. She, for reasons that may have been political, personal, religious, or simply the expression of a personality that was not interested in disappearing, decided that this was not good enough. The words were hers. The name would be attached to them. The record would show who made them. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The record did show it. Libraries preserved copies of her hymns for centuries after her death, repeatedly recopied on fresh tablets by scribes who considered them worth preserving, which in ancient Mesopotamia was the closest thing to a standing ovation the culture could provide. She was not merely archived, she was studied, she was referenced, she was treated as a foundational figure in the literary tradition that she had, largely without meaning to, established. She lived into old age, as far as we can tell, continuing to serve as a priestess, continuing to compose, continuing to be a person whose presence in the city of Ur was felt and recorded. She outlasted her own exile. She outlasted her own moment of powerlessness. She became, across the long decades of her life, something that the civilization needed to account for in its understanding of what a person could be and what a person could leave behind. She left behind 42 hymns to temples and the gods housed in them. She left behind the exaltation of Inanna. She left behind the composition that scholars call the hymn to Inanna as Queen of Heaven. And she left behind her name, pressed into clay in her own lifetime by scribes who understood that this was a person whose words were worth keeping. 4,000 years later, her compositions are still being read, translated and studied by people who never heard of Sargon's empire, except as historical context for the woman who wrote about what it felt like to stand outside the sacred house like an enemy. That is a kind of survival that very few people in any era have managed to achieve, and she managed it through words shaped carefully, deliberately, with the clear and slightly combative intention of making herself impossible to forget. There is a kind of quiet irony in the fact that the civilization that produced Enheduanna's literary voice also contained, inside its temples and its administrative buildings, the profession that made all of that possible. Not the priestesses and not the kings, but the scribes, the trained specialists who held the written record of everything and were simultaneously indispensable and invisible. And sitting down at a scribal desk in ancient Mesopotamia was not, it turns out, a comfortable or uncomplicated occupation. Let us find out what it was actually like. You wake up in the dark because the dark is when this day begins, and this day begins before most other days have decided to start. The Adubba, the House of Tablets, which is what the school and training institution where you have spent the last several years of your young life is called, does not have lenient views about when students should arrive. It has views about precision. It has views about discipline. It has views about what happens to a student who presents themselves late, and those views are expressed with a reed stick, which is a direct and efficient communication method that has the advantage of leaving no ambiguity about whether the message was received. You're not late this morning. You're not going to be late. You have not been late in 6 months, not since the last time you were late, and the teacher's assistant communicated the institution's disappointment in the aforementioned direct and efficient manner. You learned things from that experience. Not all of them were about cuneiform. You're perhaps 12 or 13 years old, which is how old most scribal students are when they begin the serious phase of their training, though some start younger, some even younger, as children placed in the Adubba by families who have decided that their son, and it is almost always a son, because the scribal profession in ancient Mesopotamia is dominated by men in a way that makes Enheduanna's achievement as a writing woman even more unusual, will benefit from the kind of training that produces a literate administrator. Your family has not made this decision lightly. The Adubba costs something to attend, not always in direct payment, but in the form of gifts to the teachers in the institution, and in the opportunity cost of a boy who is not available to work in the household or the fields during his years of training. The calculation your family has made is that a trained scribe will be worth more, eventually, than the years of labour that his training consumed. This calculation is usually correct. Scribes are always needed, scribes are always employed. The civilization runs on clay tablets, and clay tablets require people who can press signs into them with authority. The stylus is the first tool they give you, and it is the first thing you learn is not as simple as it looks. It is a piece of reed, cut at a specific angle, with a triangular tip that creates the wedge-shaped impressions that give this script its modern name, cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge-shaped. The angle at which you hold it, the pressure you apply, the direction of movement, the depth of the impression, all of these determine whether the sign you make is the correct sign or a confused mark that a reader would struggle to interpret. In the beginning, all of your marks are confused. This is expected. It is also, from your perspective, deeply humiliating, because you are trying to make signs that the teacher can make in his sleep, quickly, cleanly, without apparent thought, and your versions look like the record of a bird walking across wet clay in a state of mild distress. You practice on old tablets that have already been used, that have been soaked and the clay worked back to softness, given to students to practice on because fresh clay is a resource and you are not yet trusted with fresh clay. You press signs, you look at what you have made, you press them again. Your teacher, who is called the Umye and who has been doing this for longer than you have been alive, walks past periodically and looks at your work with the expression of a craftsman examining something that has been made incorrectly in a way he finds mildly personal. He does not always say anything. Sometimes the expression is enough. The Adaba has a social hierarchy as precise as any other institution in this city. At the top, the Umya, the master teacher, who holds authority over the entire enterprise, and who is addressed with the careful respect due to a person whose good opinion of your work directly affects your future. Below him, the senior teachers, specialists in different areas of the curriculum, some of them former palace or temple scribes who have moved into instruction, bringing with them the particular authority of people who have done the thing they are now teaching. Below them, the older students, who assist in instruction and who occupy the ambiguous position of having seniority over you while still being supervised themselves. And at the bottom, you and your cohort, the newest students, the most likely to make mistakes, the most frequently corrected. The corrections come regularly. Your signs are wrong, not dramatically wrong, not incomprehensible, but wrong in the small ways that become big ways when you are producing documents that need to be read accurately. The Umya uses a phrase you've heard many times that translates roughly as your hand does not know what your mind is asking it to do. This is both an accurate description of your current situation and a somewhat discouraging one. Your hand is learning. The hand learns slower than the mind, which is one of the perpetual frustrations of any skilled practice. The understanding arrives before the capability, and you have to live in the gap between them until the capability catches up. The curriculum at the Adaba is structured in a way that would be recognizable to anyone who has ever been a student in any institution in any era. You start with the basics, the sign list, the long inventory of cuneiform characters that represent syllables and words and concept markers and determinatives, the small signs that tell the reader what category of thing the following word belongs to. There are hundreds of signs. Learning them requires repetition of the kind that is either tedious or meditative depending on how you decide to experience it, and you spend the early months in a state of relationship with that question that varies day by day. Some mornings the repetition is calming, a rhythm, a groove you can settle into. Other mornings it is just the same morning you have been having for 3 months. After the sign list come the word lists, tablets of vocabulary organised by category, trees and wooden objects, fish and birds and animals, stones and pottery and textiles and food. The Mesopotamians made lists the way other civilizations made monuments, with great seriousness and the apparent belief that the list itself was a contribution to order. Learning the word lists was not simply vocabulary acquisition. It was a way of learning how the world was categorized, how the administration organized reality into the boxes it needed to process reality efficiently. The list of fish was not just a list of fish, it was the official Mesopotamian taxonomy of the category fish, and knowing it meant knowing how to locate a fish, for administrative purposes, in the correct place in the record-keeping system that governed the city's life. After the sign list come the word lists, tablets of vocabulary organised by category, trees and wooden objects, fish and birds and animals, stones and pottery and textiles and food. The Mesopotamians made lists the way other civilizations made monuments, with great seriousness and the apparent belief that the list itself was a contribution to order. Learning the word lists was not simply vocabulary acquisition. It was a way of learning how the world was categorized, how the administration organized reality into the boxes it needed to process reality efficiently. The list of fish was not just a list of fish. It was the official Mesopotamian taxonomy of the category fish, and knowing it meant knowing how to locate a fish, for administrative purposes, in the correct place in the record-keeping system that governed the city's life. There is a kind of quiet power in this that you are only beginning to appreciate. When you learn the correct category for a thing, you learn where that thing fits in the administrative universe. You learn how the powerful see the world organized. You learn the names that the institutions use for things, which are often different from the names that ordinary people use, and knowing both gives you a kind of bilingualism, an ability to move between registers that most people in this city do not have. Your mother knows what fish is. She does not know where fish fits in the temple's inventory system, which items from which category trigger which administrative processes, which accounts receive credit when fish is received and which accounts are charged when it is distributed. You are learning to know both. This knowledge is value. It is precisely the value your family was paying for. After the word lists come the contracts and administrative records, the actual forms you will spend most of your professional life producing: land transfers, grain receipts, loan agreements, labour records, temple inventories. You copy them endlessly, learning the formulaic language that these documents use, the conventional phrases that appear in every contract of a given type, the specific vocabulary of obligation and exchange that has been refined over centuries into the most economical and precise possible expression. This is not creative work. This is the acquisition of a professional language so thoroughly internalized that you can produce it without thinking, the way a skilled craftsman works a material without consciously directing each movement of their hands. The contract for a field transfer always begins the same way. The grain receipt always has the same structure. The loan agreement always specifies the same elements in the same order: the principal, the interest rate, the repayment date, the witnesses, the sealing formula that makes it legally binding. You copy these documents until your hand produces them without your full conscious attention, until you can write the opening formula of a land transfer while thinking about something else entirely and still produce accurate text. This is what mastery of a professional form looks like from the inside. It is less inspiring than it sounds. But there is more than administrative writing in the curriculum. The great literary works of Mesopotamian culture are also here, because a truly educated scribe does not only know how to write grain receipts. He knows the hymns to Enheduanna. He knows the laments, the mythological narratives, the royal inscriptions, the wisdom literature. He knows the compositions that circulate through the temple libraries and the palace archives as markers of cultural literacy. He copies these too, carefully, with the awareness that he is touching something that has been copied by students before him for generations. The same words in the same order, on the same standardized tablets, passed forward through time by the hands of people who understood that this was how knowledge survived. When you copy a hymn by Enheduanna, you are doing what dozens of students before you have done. You are the mechanism of transmission. Your hand is the link in the chain between the original composition, pressed into clay by a woman who has been dead for centuries, and the next reader who will pick up this tablet. You do not think about this in those terms while you are doing it, because you are thinking about the accuracy of your signs, and the angle of your stylus, and whether the clay is drying too fast at the edges. But the fact is present in the work, available to anyone who looks at it from the right distance. The archive is alive because of hands like yours. The literary tradition exists because students sat where you are sitting and pressed these signs. Lunch is a simple thing. Bread and perhaps some dried fish, eaten in the courtyard if the weather allows, in the shade of the wall if it does not. There is a social dimension to this break that matters more than the food. This is when the students talk, when the information about the city and the institution, and the careers of former students and the likely futures of current ones gets shared and analysed. You learn, during these conversations, who has been hired by which temple, whose older brother is now keeping records for a merchant house, who is said to have made a significant error on a legal document and is now managing the consequences. This information is not gossip, or not only gossip, it is professional intelligence. You're trying to understand the landscape of the career you are training for, and the landscape is made of specific stories about specific people and what happened to them. The day at the Adubba is long. You arrive before the sun and you work until the heat of the afternoon makes it impractical. The tablets you work on in the summer morning have to be used before the clay dries, so there is a natural deadline built into the material, a quiet urgency that keeps the pace from becoming too relaxed. In the winter, the clay can be worked for longer, but the light is shorter, and the Adubba, which is lit by the same small oil lamps as every other building in the city, offers limited illumination for close detail work once the sun goes down. Your teachers are former scribes, men who have spent their careers in the temples and the palaces and the merchant houses, and have now moved into instruction, passing on what they know because that is how the institution perpetuates itself. Some of them are warm in a carefully concealed way, allowing themselves a small expression of satisfaction when a student masters something difficult. Others are not warm at all and make no attempt to conceal the fact. The teaching methods throughout are consistent. Demonstration, repetition, correction, more repetition. There is no particular theory of pedagogy here. There is only the observable fact that if you do something enough times under supervision, you eventually do it correctly, and doing it correctly is the only thing that matters. The building where you spend your days is not impressive from the outside. It is mud brick, like everything else, arranged around a central courtyard where the light is better, where students can work on tablets in the open air during the cooler parts of the year. The rooms inside are low-ceilinged and lit by oil lamps, which provide a warm, slightly smoky light that is adequate for the work but not luxurious. The smell of the place is distinctive. Clay, both wet and dry, the slightly bitter smell of lamp oil, the particular dusty smell that accumulates in buildings where a great deal of writing has been done, as if the concentration of signs pressed into clay has left a residue in the air of the room itself. You've been breathing this smell for 3 years. You would recognize it anywhere, forever. Graduation from the Adubba, if that is even the right word for it, is less an event and more a transition. There is no ceremony. There is no certificate pressed into your hands by a proud teacher. What happens is that you become good enough to be employed, and then you are employed, and your life as a working scribe begins with the same lack of dramatic announcement as most things begin in a civilization that is more interested in records than in celebrations. Your first position is likely a junior role in a temple administrative office, which is where most scribes begin, because the temples are the largest institutions in the city, and they require the largest volume of written record keeping. You sit in a room with other scribes and you produce documents all day, which sounds simple and is not simple, because every document you produce is a legal record, a binding instrument, a piece of information that will be referred to again, possibly in a dispute, possibly in an audit, possibly in a court of some kind if the matter it records becomes contested. The accuracy and completeness of what you write matters in ways that are not theoretical. An error in a land transfer can generate a legal dispute that lasts for generations. An error in a grain record can be interpreted as fraud. The stakes of a clerical error in this world are higher than you might hope, and your first months in the role are conducted with the specific anxiety of someone who knows that they are competent, but not yet entirely certain that their competence is sufficient. Cuneiform is pressed into wet clay tablets that then dry. This sounds simple. The practical implications are several. You must work at a pace that keeps you ahead of the drying, which is faster in the summer and slower in the winter, and you must read your own work before the clay sets, because a mistake on a dried tablet cannot be corrected. There are no erasures. You cannot cross something out and write it again neatly. If you make a significant error on a fresh tablet, you can smooth it and start over, but once it dries, it is permanent. The permanence is the point. These records are meant to last. They are meant to be consulted again, next month, next year, in 40 years when someone's grandson is contesting a property boundary and the original land transfer is brought out of the archive and read. You're not making notes. You are making history, in the most literal sense, a fixed record of what occurred, in permanent form, stored in an institution that will keep it for as long as the institution stands. The social position of a scribe is a carefully calibrated thing. You are not a labourer. You have a skill that most people do not have, and that skill gives you access to information and institutions that are closed to most people. You can move between the ordinary world and the administrative world in a way that almost no one else can. You're useful to the powerful because the powerful need their words and their records and their correspondence produced by someone who knows what they are doing, and you are the person who knows what they are doing. But you are also not independent. You serve the institution that employs you. Your skill is valuable precisely because you will use it for your employer's purposes and not your own purposes, and the line between those two things is one that a working scribe must be continually aware of. The administrative power you hold, the ability to shape records, to select what gets written down and how, to phrase a contract in ways that are technically accurate but slightly favourable to one interpretation, is a power that has to be exercised with consistent discretion, because the moment you are suspected of using it for anything other than your employer's interests, the position that gives you that power disappears. Most of the texts that survive from ancient Mesopotamia are administrative records, grain deliveries, labour obligations, property transactions, temple inventories. They survive because clay is nearly indestructible, and because the volume of administrative writing was enormous, and because much of it ended up preserved by accident, buried in collapsed buildings or stored in rooms that were never reopened. Most of the scribes who produced those records are anonymous. We have the documents, we do not have the names. They pressed their signs into the clay with trained and careful hands, and they did not sign their work, and they lived and died inside the institutional structures they served, and the record of them is the record of what they recorded, not the record of themselves. But every now and then one of them left something that was more than an inventory, a note in the margin, a colophon at the end of a copied text that says, "I copied this in the palace, in such and such a year, and the hand that copied it was mine." A small exercise tablet with a student's complaint scratched into the edge, a fragment of the actual human experience inside the formal frame of the professional task. These marginal things are, in some ways, the most interesting things in the archive, because they are the moments when the invisible hand that held the stylus briefly becomes visible, a person sitting in a room pressing signs into clay, doing what they were trained to do, in a city that needed them and did not particularly think about what it felt like to be them. What it felt like probably was this: competent mostly in the practiced way of someone who has done the same thing enough times that the skill is in the hands and not in the conscious mind. Tired, often, in the particular way of close work in limited light, with the constant low pressure of accuracy, connected to something larger than themselves, because they were connected to the record, to the archive, to the continuous thread of documentation that held the civilization together and would continue to hold it together long after they were gone. And occasionally perhaps sitting at the scribal desk with a fresh tablet in front of them and the stylus in their hand, they noticed, in the way you notice things when you have been doing the same thing for long enough that the automatic part of your brain has taken over, that they were pressing marks into clay that would last longer than almost anything else in their world. And maybe that was enough. And maybe, on the days when the heat was pressing down and the work was tedious, and the teacher's voice still lived somewhere in the back of their memory, telling them to correct the angle of the stylus, it was not quite enough, and they pressed on anyway because the clay was drying and the work was not finished and the city needed its records kept. There is a particular satisfaction in being the person who knows, not in a grandiose way, not with the swagger of someone who has confused the map for the territory, but in the quieter, more durable way of someone who understands how a system works and can therefore navigate it. You know which temple official to approach for which category of request. You know which records to consult when a question about a prior transaction arises. You know the conventions that govern different kinds of documents, which phrases are standard and which would be unusual, and what the presence of an unusual phrase probably means. This knowledge is the actual product of your years in the Adaba, not the ability to press signs, which is the mechanical component. The knowledge of what the signs mean in context, and what their arrangement tells you about the intentions of the people who produce the documents you're reading, and what you can infer from what is not said as well as from what is. That is the skill. That is what takes years to develop. And once you have it, you have something that the city needs. The temple office where you work is staffed by perhaps a dozen scribes of varying seniority, plus the supervisors and administrators above them, and the runners and assistants below. It is a small world with very specific social dynamics that you understand more precisely with each passing month. The senior scribe, a man of perhaps 50, who has been in this role for 20 years, is the actual centre of authority in the room, more so than the administrator above him, who has the formal title, but does not have the deep institutional knowledge that makes the office actually function. The administrator knows this. The senior scribe knows this. The relationship between them is conducted with careful mutual respect and a studied avoidance of any situation that would require either of them to acknowledge it explicitly. You have learned to read the atmosphere of the office. The days when the administrator arrives looking pressed and distracted are days when something has happened in the palace hierarchy that has created pressure that will eventually flow downward through the institution to this room. The days when the senior scribe is in a particular kind of quiet are days when a document in the current workflow has a problem that he is working out without advertising. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, because the problem involves someone above him, and the solution requires discretion. You file these observations without comment. You're junior enough that commenting would be inappropriate, and you are senior enough now to understand that the appropriate response to most institutional tension is to do your work correctly and wait for the weather to change. The work itself has become second nature. You produce contracts, receipts, inventories, correspondence. You prepare the clay tablets in the morning, let them reach the right consistency, and work through the day's assignments with the practiced efficiency of someone whose hands know their job. You make very few errors now. The ones you make are the kind that come from fatigue or distraction, not from insufficient skill, and you catch them before the clay dries. This is progress. You can feel it in the absence of anxiety that used to accompany every document, the quiet confidence that what comes out of your hands will be accurate, because it almost always is. You carry a cylinder seal now, your professional identity pressed into a small carved cylinder of stone that you roll across the wet clay of documents you have produced to leave your mark. It is a small thing, no longer than a finger joint, carved with a simple design that identifies you without depicting anything particularly important. But it represents something. When you seal a document, you are taking responsibility for its accuracy and its legitimacy. Your seal on a tablet is your word, and in a civilization where words are pressed into clay and stored forever, your word is permanent. The years in the working institution teach you things the Aduba did not. They teach you about power in its practical form, not the abstract hierarchy of authority, but the specific dynamics of a real office, in a real institution where real people have real interests and real relationships that shape which decisions get made and how. You learn which of your supervisors is genuinely competent and which is simply positioned. You learn where the actual information about institutional finances is kept and who has access to it and what that access is used for. You learn the difference between the official account of a situation and the account that circulates in the corridors among people who know, and you learn which one to use in which context. This is not cynicism, it is literacy, of a different kind from the literacy of signs and contracts, but just as essential for operating in this world. The city always needed its records kept. This was not a coincidence. The records, and the institutions that produced and stored them, were not simply a service provided by the civilization. They were the civilization, in a meaningful sense, or at least they were the framework inside which the civilization understood itself. And the institution at the center of all of that record keeping, the institution that owned the most land and employed the most scribes and stored the most tablets and held the most power in the daily life of the city, was the temple, which brings us to what the temple actually was, as opposed to what it was officially described as being, and those two things are much more interesting apart than they are together. Stand at the base of the ziggurat of Ur and look up. This is not a difficult instruction to follow because from the base there is not much else to look at. The structure rises above you in a series of massive terrace stages, each one slightly smaller than the one below, tapering upward toward the shrine at the top where the god was understood to dwell, or at least to be accessible, the way a very important person is accessible if you can find your way to the right floor of the right building. The mud brick is faced with baked brick in the lower sections, giving it a durability that sun-dried brick alone does not possess. The walls slope slightly inward, a batter, an architectural technique that gives the structure its visual solidity, its sense of pressing downward into the earth with intention. It is large in a way that requires recalibration. Not large the way a mountain is large, which is natural and therefore does not demand accounting for. Large in the way that a thing humans built is large when they have organized enormous numbers of other humans to build it over a sustained period of time, large as a demonstration. Look at what was done here. Look at what this city is capable of organising. This is what the temple was supposed to be, the house of the god, the meeting point between the divine and the human, the sacred structure at the centre of the city's spiritual life, maintained by priests and priestesses, supported by the devotion of the population, the place where the relationship between the city and its patron deity was enacted, maintained and made real through daily ritual, offering and prayer. All of that was true. The temple was genuinely a religious institution. The rituals were genuinely performed. The priests and priestesses who maintained them believed in what they were doing with the same seriousness and sincerity that people in religious institutions everywhere and in all eras bring to the work they consider sacred. The god was fed daily, clothed daily, attended to with the consistency and care you would give to a very powerful being who was physically present and whose goodwill you could not afford to lose. But also, and this is where things get considerably more interesting, the temple was a bank, a landlord, a factory, a trading house, an employer, a court of law, a distributor of welfare, a storage facility, a workshop, an agricultural enterprise, and a political power that operated with relative independence from whatever king happened to be sitting on the throne at a given moment. The temple owned land, a lot of land. In some cities during some periods, the temple owned the majority of productive agricultural land in the entire region. It employed workers, not just priests, but craftspeople, weavers, potters, brewers, fishermen, herders, farmers, and the scribes, who recorded all of the activity of all of those workers in the archive that was itself housed inside the temple complex. The temple collected grain. It stored grain. It lent grain with interest to farmers who needed seed for the next planting and would repay when the harvest came. It collected the repayments, added the interest, recorded everything, stored the surplus, and used the surplus to fund the next round of operations. If that sounds like a bank, it is because that is what it was, or at least what it was also. The temple did not separate its spiritual function from its economic function, because that distinction would have made no sense to the people operating it. The god owned the land. The god's servants administered the land. The returns from the land supported the god's house and the people who served it. This was not a corruption of religion by commerce. It was a fully integrated system in which divine ownership was the theological foundation for an economic operation of considerable scale and sophistication. The records that survive from Mesopotamian temples are extraordinarily detailed. Grain in, grain out, labour performed, wages paid in rations, land cultivated, animals managed, workshops operating, trade conducted. These records were not kept because the administrators were fond of paperwork. They were kept because an institution of this complexity, managing resources across this many domains, could not function without a continuous written record of what it owned, what it owed, what it had, and what it expected to receive. The archive was not the dead storage of completed transactions. It was the operational memory of a living institution, consulted constantly, updated daily, referenced whenever a dispute arose or a calculation needed to be made. The workers in temple operations did not have what we would call a choice about whether to participate. The temple was the city's largest employer, but employment here often meant something quite different from a voluntary labour arrangement. Temple workshops in some periods and cities operated with workers who were, in various degrees, unfree. Some were dependents of the institution who had been placed there by families who could not support them. Some were captives from military expeditions who had been assigned to temple workshops. Some were indentured workers, people who had fallen into debt to the temple and were working it off in rations rather than currency. The temple's labour force existed across a spectrum that ranged from professional administrators and skilled craftspeople who were genuinely valued and relatively well compensated to workers in weaving workshops who received the minimum ration that would keep them functional and working. The weaving workshops deserve particular attention because the surviving records about them are unusually specific, and what they describe is, in plain terms, a managed labour force of women, including many women and girls who were the dependents of absent or deceased male relatives, maintained inside temple facilities and given rations in exchange for the production of specific quantities of cloth. The quotas were real. The records show that production was tracked, that shortfalls were noted, and that the records of what each worker produced were kept with the same precision applied to grain deliveries and land transfers. The women in these workshops were not slaves in the simple sense, but they were not free in any meaningful sense either. They were inside the temple system, and the temple system was not designed around their preferences. The archives connected to these workshops are extraordinary in their specificity. We have records that name individual women workers, specify their daily rations in litres of barley, or portions of oil, or allocations of wool, note when they were sick and could not work, note when they died and their rations stopped, note the ages of their children who were also within the temple's orbit of dependency. These are real people, captured in the kind of administrative record that was never intended to be anything more than a management tool, never intended to be read by anyone outside the institution that produced it, certainly never intended to survive 4,000 years and be read by scholars trying to understand what daily life felt like inside one of the ancient world's largest institutions. They were recorded because they needed to be managed. They survive because clay is nearly indestructible, and they tell us something that the theological language of the temple would never say directly, that the divine household contained within it a managed population of people whose lives were organized by institutional necessity rather than by their own preferences, and that this was considered a normal, unremarkable feature of how the institution operated. This is one of the places where the official image and the lived reality diverge most sharply. The temple, in the theological understanding of Mesopotamian civilization, was the household of the god. The workers in the temple were, in a sense, members of that household, participants in the divine enterprise, doing work that supported the sacred mission. That is how the institution described itself, or at least how the theological framework surrounding it described the relationship. The weaver in the workshop, pressing through her quota of cloth, receiving her grain ration, under the supervision of an overseer who was himself answerable to higher administration, may have experienced the divine household somewhat differently. The temple also functioned as something resembling a welfare institution. In a society without a state in the modern sense, the temple was often the entity that provided for the city's most vulnerable. The widows and orphans who had no male relative to support them, the elderly who could no longer work their land, the disabled who could not contribute to household production. The temple records are full of these people, small ration allotments listed by name or category, distributed from the temple stores. It was not charity in the sense we might understand. It was an institutional function, built into the temple's operating model, derived from the theological understanding that the god's household had an obligation to the people under its protection. But it was also real. People who would otherwise have starved were eating because the temple had grain and a system for distributing it to those who could not obtain it otherwise. The welfare function also served the temple's institutional interests in ways that were probably not articulated as such. A temple that cared for the widows and orphans of its city was a temple that had deep roots in that city's population, roots that went below the level of official theology into the lived experience of people whose survival had at some point depended on the institution's grain stores. That kind of connection is politically valuable in a way that is difficult to quantify but easy to observe in the records. When the temple's authority was challenged, when its autonomy was threatened by palace encroachment or by political instability, the network of people whose welfare depended on its functioning was a source of resilience that pure institutional authority could not replicate. The temple was defended not only by its theological legitimacy, but by its practical indispensability to the lives of the city's most vulnerable people. The temple also served as the custodian of the city's collective memory, in ways that went beyond the keeping of administrative records. The myths and hymns and laments that circulated through the temple's ritual life contained within them the accumulated understanding of how the world worked, why the gods were as they were, what the right relationship between human beings and divine power required. This was not separate from the economic and political functions. It was the frame within which all of those functions were understood. A community that shared a common mythology, that performed together the rituals through which that mythology was enacted and renewed, was a community with a shared basis for trust, for cooperation, for the resolution of conflict through recognized institutions rather than through violence. The temple's cultural function was also, in this sense, its most fundamental political function, maintaining the shared framework within which everything else could operate. What the records show us, when we read them carefully and without the expectation that ancient institutions should look like modern ones, is an organization of tremendous complexity, operating over an extraordinarily long period of time. Mesopotamian temple institutions were not a feature of a brief historical moment. They were continuous presences in the life of the region for 3,000 years. The specific temples changed, the specific gods waxed and waned in prominence, the specific relationships between sacred and secular authority shifted as empires rose and fell, but the basic structure, a major religious institution at the center of urban life, owning land, employing workers, managing resources, performing rituals, keeping records, and providing services that no other institution was positioned to provide, persisted from the earliest urban settlements of southern Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium before the Common Era through to the late Persian and early Greek periods, when the Cuneiform tradition finally gave way to other writing systems and other institutional forms. That is a continuous institutional tradition, longer than the entire span of Western history from the fall of Rome to the present. It is worth pausing to absorb that. The relationship between the temple and the palace was one of the great ongoing negotiations of Mesopotamian political life. In the earliest periods, the temple appeared to hold more primary power, the chief priest or priestess being effectively the most important figure in the city. Over time, in many cities, a separate palace institution developed, with a king who was distinct from the high priest and who held military and political authority, while the temple retained its economic and religious functions. This arrangement was sometimes cooperative and sometimes competitive. Kings needed the temple's legitimacy, because in a civilization where the gods owned the land and the king governed on behalf of the gods, royal authority derived some of its justification from the divine sanction that the temple represented. Temples needed the palace's military protection and the administrative resources of a royal government. They needed each other, and they knew it, and they spent the duration of Mesopotamian civilization working out the terms of that relationship in ways that occasionally became direct conflict. The specifics of this negotiation varied enormously across the centuries and across different cities. In some periods, temple and palace operated with relative independence, each managing its own resources and sphere of influence, occasionally cooperating on major projects but generally maintaining separate administrative systems. In other periods, particularly under strong kings who actively worked to consolidate authority, the temple's independence was systematically reduced, its resources redirected toward royal projects, its administrative structure brought under closer palace oversight. When this happened, the temple did not disappear. It continued performing its religious functions, but its economic autonomy was curtailed in ways that were consequential for everyone who depended on it, from the priests who managed it to the workers who relied on its rations to the farmers who had borrowed its grain. There are periods in the records where temples appear to have accumulated resources and autonomy to a degree that made kings uneasy. Royal inscriptions boasting of temple renovations and endowments were partly genuine piety, and partly the palace's way of demonstrating that it was still in charge of the most important institution in the city. Other inscriptions record royal reforms that reduced temple autonomy, consolidated their land holdings under royal control, or reorganized their administrative structures in ways that happened to align the temple's interests more closely with the palace's interests. These reforms were not usually described as the king taking power from the temple. They were described as the king acting in accordance with divine will to correct abuses and restore proper order. The language of piety and the language of power were, in Mesopotamian political communication, frequently indistinguishable. The temple was also, in certain periods and in certain cities, a lender at scale, not just to farmers needing seed grain, but to merchants undertaking trade expeditions, to craftspeople needing raw materials, to private households managing short-term shortfalls. Temple loans came with interest, as almost all loans in Mesopotamia did, and the records of these loans, the amounts, the parties, the interest rates, the repayment terms, survive in extraordinary detail. They show an institution engaged in something that looks, from a certain angle, exactly like the financial activities we associate with modern banking, mobilizing stored resources, deploying them as productive capital, collecting returns, managing risk across a large portfolio of individual transactions. The fact that this institution was also responsible for dressing the god's statue and performing the daily rituals and maintaining the sacred fires did not make it any less a financial institution. It was both, completely, simultaneously, without apparent tension. The merchants who borrowed from temples were undertaking what the records call a tamkarum arrangement, a system in which the merchant received silver or goods from the temple as working capital for a trading expedition, and agreed to return a specified amount at expedition's end. The arrangement was not simply a loan, it was a kind of commercial partnership in which the temple shared in the merchant's success, without sharing in his physical risk. If the expedition was profitable, the temple received its return, and the merchant kept the surplus. If the expedition failed or the merchant died, the situation became considerably more complicated, involving the merchant's family and the temple's legal resources in a negotiation that could extend across years. The records of these arrangements are detailed, specific, and occasionally quite dramatic in the way that financial distress always generates drama when it arrives in the lives of specific people who had specific plans that have stopped working. Long-distance trade was a major temple activity in many periods. The temples of southern Mesopotamia had access to grain in large quantities, but they lacked timber, stone, and metal, which had to come from the mountains and the coasts of the surrounding regions. Temple merchants carried grain and textiles south and east, and returned with the materials that the building programs and the workshops needed. The records of these expeditions sometimes survive in considerable detail, enough to trace the routes, the goods, the exchange rates, and the outcomes of individual commercial journeys that happened more than 4,000 years ago. This is one of the stranger aspects of studying Mesopotamia. You can sometimes reconstruct the commercial biography of a single merchant in more detail than you can reconstruct almost any aspect of the lives of ordinary people in many more recent historical periods, simply because clay preserves documents that papyrus and parchment do not. Private individuals could and did store valuables at the temple. Silver in particular, which was the primary medium of high-value exchange in Mesopotamia, could be deposited with temple administrators who would record the deposit and be accountable for its return. Whether this constitutes banking in a technical sense is a question that scholars discuss at considerable length and with more enthusiasm than might be immediately apparent to someone coming to the topic fresh. What it clearly constitutes is a system in which the temple's sacred authority, its permanence, its institutional continuity across generations, its divine legitimacy, made it a trusted custodian of things that mattered, a neutral party that both sides of a transaction could agree to trust because it answered to the gods rather than to either of them. The temple was also, in ways that become visible when you look at the records carefully, an institution that had to navigate the gap between its theological self-description and its operational realities. The god's household was supposed to be a model of divine order. The workers within it were supposed to be participants in a sacred enterprise. The goods flowing through it were supposed to be the god's property, managed by the god's servants for the god's purposes. This was the official account, sincerely held and ritually maintained. The operational account was more complicated. Hay were the same compartment, viewed from different angles. The god owned the land. The god's servants managed it. The management produced wealth. The wealth supported the institution. The institution performed the rituals that maintained the divine relationship on which the city's welfare depended. Remove any part of this system, and the rest stops working. But the integration was not always comfortable, even for people inside the institution. Priests who were also administrators faced questions that their theological training did not entirely prepare them to answer. When the temple's grain reserves were low, the decision about who received rations and who did not was not made by the god. It was made by the administrator, who had to balance the institution's obligations against its actual resources and who lived with the consequences of getting that balance wrong. When a merchant defaulted on a temple loan, the process of recovering the debt involved human decision-making about proportionality, about the circumstances of the default, about the mesh between the legal framework and the specific situation. These decisions required judgment, and judgment in a hierarchical institution is always complicated by the question of whose interests you are ultimately serving. The temples also had to contend with the problem that plagues every large institution that has been operating for a long time: the accumulation of obligations that made sense individually, but collectively created a structure of commitments that was difficult to service simultaneously. Temple lands that had been donated by wealthy individuals came with attached obligations to perform specific rituals for those donors or their descendants in perpetuity. Enough of these donations accumulated over enough generations, produced a ritual calendar that was extremely full and an economic obligation that required very precise management of resources to fulfill. The famous reforms of the king Urnama and his dynasty in the third dynasty of Ur were partly attempts to rationalize exactly this kind of accumulated institutional complexity, to reconcile the weight of inherited obligation with the practical requirements of running an institution that needed to remain solvent. The sacred and the commercial were, in Mesopotamian life, not separate compartments. They were the same compartment, viewed from different angles. The god owned the land. The god's servants managed it. The management produced wealth. The wealth supported the institution. The institution performed the rituals that maintained the divine relationship on which the city's welfare depended. Remove any part of this system and the rest stops working. It was integrated not because the ancient Mesopotamians were confused about the difference between religion and commerce, but because they were operating in a world where those categories had not yet separated, where the divine framework was not a gloss on a secular reality, but the actual explanatory structure within which all of reality was understood and organized. What this means, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What this means, practically, is that the temple was neither simply what its theology said it was, nor simply the exploitative institution that the grimmer parts of the labour record suggest. It was both, and understanding it requires holding both of those things in mind at the same time, which is uncomfortable but accurate. The daily rituals were genuine. The obligations imposed on workers were also genuine. The care extended to vulnerable dependents was real. The extraction from those same dependents was also real. The temple was a human institution operating inside a theological framework, which means it shared all the properties of human institutions: the genuine commitment, the systematic exploitation, the moments of real compassion, and the structural indifference to individual suffering that any large organization that has been running for centuries tends to develop toward its lowest status participants. The floods came and the floods receded. Kings rose and fell. Empires consolidated and then fragmented. New languages arrived and the old ones retreated into ritual use, maintained by scribes who learned them for the same reason they learned everything else, because the institution required it. Through all of it, the canal moved, the grain was planted and harvested, the tablets were pressed and archived, and the temple performed its rituals on the schedule the divine calendar demanded. The continuity was not accidental. It was managed carefully by generations of people who understood that the system they were serving was larger than any individual life, and more important than any individual preference, and who did their work accordingly. The city around it endured. People carried water from the canal. People made their bread and cooked their lentils and argued in the market about the price of sesame oil. The scribes pressed their signs into clay, and the records accumulated, and the archive grew. The high priestess sang her hymns in the inner sanctum, and argued with the goddess about what was owed, and what had been taken, and what needed to be restored. The workers in the weaving workshop pressed through their quotas. The merchant borrowed against his next expedition, and the temple recorded it, and expected to be repaid. And the great step tower at the centre of the city rose into the flat Mesopotamian sky, visible from a very long distance in every direction, marking a civilization that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more brutal and more human than most people who have not looked closely at the records would expect. Tonight we have travelled through a world that is very old and very strange and, if you have been paying attention, not quite as foreign as it first appeared. We spent a morning in an ancient city in Mesopotamia, carrying water and bricks and worrying about the price of oil, navigating the heat and the bureaucracy and the canal smell and the temple obligations, and the small, persistent satisfactions of an ordinary life conducted inside an extraordinary civilization. The physical world of that city, the mud brick walls, the narrow alleys, the river-fed irrigation channels, the white-hot afternoon light, was unlike anything we are likely to experience. But the structure of that day, the morning task and the institutional obligation, and the market negotiation, and the evening meal and the sound of the city settling towards sleep, had a shape that any of us, in any city in any era, would recognise without being told to. We followed Enheduanna across the complicated arc of her life, the powerful appointment, The years of sacred service, the exile that stripped her of everything she was, and the restoration that gave it back. What is remarkable about her is not simply that she was the first named author in recorded history, though that alone is remarkable enough. What is remarkable is that she used the tools available to her, the hymn form, the religious framework, the literary conventions of her tradition, to say something unmistakably personal and unmistakably urgent. She was not performing piety, she was arguing her case. And because clay is harder to destroy than almost anything else, that argument is still here, still pressing in the same marks, still carrying the same weight it carried when she shaped it in a city that no longer exists above the surface of the earth. We sat at a scribal desk and learned what it meant to be a trained specialist in a civilization that ran on written records. The anxiety of accuracy, the tedium of repetition, the particular social position of someone who is indispensable and invisible in equal measure, and the quiet fact that the civilization those scribes served would not have been a civilization at all without their accumulated labour, without the tens of thousands of tablets they pressed and stored and organised, without the archive that held the civilization's memory of itself. Most of them are anonymous. Their names are not attached to their work, but their work is still here, in museums, in collections, in the slow, careful scholarship of people who are still reading what they wrote and still finding it worth reading. And we looked at the temple, the great institution at the centre of Mesopotamian life, and understood that what it was officially was not the same as what it actually was. The house of the god was also a bank, a factory, a welfare office, a political power, a landlord with extensive portfolio management problems. This is not a debunking of the temple's religious significance. The rituals were real. The faith was real. What we found, instead, was an institution that had found a way to integrate the sacred and the practical, so completely that neither could be disentangled from the other, which is perhaps the most human thing a human institution can do. The thread running through all of it, if there is one, is this. The people who lived in ancient Mesopotamia were navigating the same fundamental challenges that people have always navigated, which is to say the challenge of organising a shared life in a world that is indifferent to individual comfort and relentless in its demands. They solved those challenges with tools that look unfamiliar to us: cuneiform tablets, mud brick ziggurats, divine ownership of agricultural land, clay seals on contract documents. But the problems they were solving, how to store and distribute food, how to manage collective labour, how to maintain the information a complex society needs to function, how to hold authority accountable, and how to argue with that authority when it fails you, those problems are not old. They are ongoing. They have always been ongoing. The tablets are just a very durable version of the notes we are still taking. It is late now, wherever you are. The day you have lived is its own thing, with its own particular weight, its own small obligations met and not met, its own version of the morning task and the market negotiation and the evening meal. The city outside your window, or the quiet wherever you are, is making whatever sounds it makes at this hour, the particular ambient hum of the world at rest, which is not silence but is close enough to it that the body begins to understand that it is allowed to release its hold on the day. Let it go. The canal is not waiting for you. The tablets will not dry before morning. The archive has been kept for now, and tomorrow is an ordinary day inside a civilization that has been here longer than it needs you to remember, doing its quiet work of continuing to exist, which is the only thing civilizations are ultimately trying to do. Rest now. The bricks will wait. The stylus is down. And the city, the old city, the city between the rivers, is settling into the kind of dark that comes when the lamp oil has burned low and there is nothing left to press into clay except the indentation of sleep. And even that, the old scribes would tell you, is worth recording, because it means the day is done, and the day being done means the next one can begin. And in a civilization that has been running for 4,000 years on the quiet insistence of people who kept going despite everything, that is enough. That has always been enough. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.